Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. I'm going to present you a very short overview of the applications of finite element methods to electromagnetic problems. So my talk is structured as follows. I'll just give a brief reminder of the method itself, assuming that some of you are not familiar with it. Then the focus will then be on its application to different types of electromagnetic problems, and you will see that there is a very large variety of them. I will stress some specific features associated with Maxwell's equations, and then we'll give you a brief tour of the available tools, which are either open source or commercial softwares, present you some illustrations, and then conclude. First, the finite element method. Well, its context, of course, is that engineering and science problems can only rarely be solved exactly. And so for most real-life problems, people need to resort to numerical methods to obtain accurate approximations to the solutions of their problems. The method appeared now some 85 years ago, and it rapidly became extremely popular in numerical analysis, and I dare say a battle horse in engineering simulations. Historically, it was first applied to structural analysis, to elasticity problems, dams, aircraft wings, and then later on, but already decades ago from now, it was progressively applied to fluid flow analysis, heat transfer problems, and then all domains of electromagnetism. So in these engineering and physics problems, typically one studies a phenomenon over a given region of space where the equations need to be solved, subject to some boundary conditions. For instance, classic problems are stress and strain distributions inside a mechanical assembly, or the airflow around an aircraft. Many more applications I will show you. Next, I would stress here on the way to the main body of the talk that many other approaches exist, but there is no time today to discuss them. So how the finite element method works, you have a domain of interest where you want to solve a problem. The domain is decomposed into a mesh of small cells, the finite elements. So problem can be 1D, 2D, 3D. In 1D, your elements are segments of a straight line. In 2D, you can have triangles, quadrilaterals typically, and in 3D, tetrahedra, hexahedra, prisms, etc. So once the domain is decomposed, one expresses a solution approximately as a combination of simple basis functions, which are defined over each element. Then the equations of the problem are cast in what one calls a variational or weak formulation. And for instance, in elasticity problem, one can formulate the problem as a minimum problem for a global quantity, the strain energy. And one can show that the exact solution of the problem minimizes this quantity. So from this approach, a system of equations is built and solved numerically on the computer. So typically, well, here are some generic element shapes in 1D, 2D, or 3D. And so first in 2D, on the top, you see a very simple decomposition of a domain into triangles. You see also that the triangles approximate the boundary, which is in general not made of straight lines. So this is a kind of approximation in itself. In 2D, you have this other example of the profile of an airfoil, and then a 3D example here of a kind of a missile discretized by means of tetrahedra. I will stress here that meshing complex objects is really a very specialized activity. And here is an example from a very well-known mesher program, which is called GMesh, developed at universities of Liège and Louvain, and is really used worldwide in various other programs. You see on the top left a mechanical part, which is first roughly discretized into triangles. These triangles are not very nice because some of them are extremely elongated, and this is not good at all for the accuracy and the stability of the numerical method. So these meshing programs are able then to improve the mesh by various automatic strategies, and come, say, to the lower left picture, where you see that the elements have an aspect ratio which is nearly 1, so it's almost equilateral triangles everywhere. So this is already far better, but you see that at the edges of the exact object, there are still some funny things happening. Things are not very smooth. And you see that the further improvement is possible with a meshing program which is able to detect edges. And then after this step, you obtain a very fine mesh which takes into account the sharp edges of the domain. Second step of the method is the selection of simple basis functions over each element, which are typically polynomials. Perhaps the simplest one is here the linear hat basis function. You see that in red, I indicate each time one element. You see here you have one linear function over this element, another one over the next. And so by selecting a collection of these basis functions, one can approximate the solution that will have to be found. On the right, you have elements with higher degree basis functions, here cubic polynomials, which in general give you much better accuracy. These are just examples. There are very large numbers of finite elements, and actually people even store them in kind of, well, online encyclopedias. So once we have the elements and the basis functions, one seeks an approximate solution to the problem as a sum of basis functions, which I note here phi I, times unknown coefficients. And so these are the things that we need to determine with a computer. For instance, if you take linear basis functions in one dimension, you have these hat functions, and with them you can represent a piecewise linear function with its unknown coefficients u1, u2, u3. If you add more basis functions of higher degree, you enrich the space of solution, and you end up with a more smooth representation and more accurate solution, hopefully, of the solution. This shows you the case of a regular mesh where all the elements have the same length. But of course, in actual problems, it's usually appropriate to make this dimension vary from place to place in order to capture all the phenomena that you're interested in. The first step of the method then is to build and solve a system of equation from the unknown coefficients of which multiply my basis function. And well, basically this is built by the computer. It builds a large system of linear equations for the case of a linear equation. This system is solved on the computer, and then you get your approximate solution. General structure of a finite element program. Usually you always have a geometry model where you define the domain of interest. This can also be imported from CAD programs most of the time. I would say that some solvers have very specific features in which you can parameterize the geometry that you want to study and program scans of parameters which are then executed automatically. Next, you have to define the problem. That is, besides the geometry, the type of equation that you want to solve and the boundary conditions. The choice of resolution methods. There are various ones based on the frequency domain analysis, time domain, eigenvalue problems in electromagnetic problems. Then you have the meshing step. As I showed you by example before, there are automatic procedures to generate the mesh and to locally refine it sometimes with guidance from the user, sometimes fully automatic. And some programs allow adaptive meshing. That is, once you've found the first solution, you find where most of the details are in the solution, and you can let the program refine the mesh where it really matters and repeat the solution with a higher accuracy. Next step after the problem has been meshed is to assemble the system of equation, then to solve it with a computer. And then once you have the solution, there's very important post-processing steps, which allow you to represent the solutions in great details and through cuts. When, for instance, you're solving a 3D problem, it's very important to be able to look at all the details of the complex solution. And from this post-processing step, you can also derive quantities like equivalent electrical parameters, etc. Okay. I would stress here that multi-physics simulations are more and more common, where you not only solve, for instance, an electrical problem, but since the electrical problem allows you to compute the ohmic losses, for instance, associated with a solution, you can then input these losses to a thermal analysis solver and make some coupled simulations between electrical and thermal phenomena. This is just an example among a large number of possibilities. I would stress also that these codes exploit all the features of modern computers, and this allows really to deal with more and more realistic and complex problems as time goes on. Now let's move to specific electromagnetic applications. Typically, they're in contrast with what happens, for instance, in structural mechanics. We have wave phenomena with typical wavelengths, which I call lambda here, whereas your domain of simulation has dimensions with a size which I note capital L. And besides that, you have a finite element mesh. If you want to represent a given wavelength on a finite element mesh, you need the mesh to be fine enough and so to be much smaller, in fact, than the wavelength. This is one thing to consider. You can also use higher degree basis functions, which will also help improve the accuracy of the solution. And an important thing, of course, in practical problems is the number of wavelengths that you get on your simulation domain, because then if you have many wavelengths, you will have a very large number of finite elements and then a very large problem to solve. Okay, another important thing to note with Maxwell problems, in contrast with classical elasticity problems, is that due care is required to make sure that the numerical methods are stable, and this requires the construction of suitable basis functions. So the naive functions that I showed in the introduction need to be actually chosen with more care in the case of Maxwell problems, but I don't have time to go into further details. The electromagnetic applications are really very broad, and various approximations are made depending on the ratio of the problem size to the wavelength. And well, typically the applications are across the electromagnetic spectrum. Many of them are from DC, so even electrostatics, to the microwave range. But actually, if you study a very small domain, you can even study optical effects, since they are governed by Maxwell's equation. So these methods are really of very broad applicability. This is just a view graph to show you that there are many other methods than the finite element method here, which is in this orange box. The vertical axis shows the electrical size of a problem. For instance, if you were interested in the radar cross-sections of ships or airplanes, you're talking of very short wavelengths and very large domains, and there you will typically use different approximations. And perhaps that in this such large problems, you don't want to use the finite element method, but well, this is our topic today. Inside these problems that we can tackle with the FEM. We can range from electrostatics, where we can, for instance, compute the capacitance and the electric field distributions over objects, electrokinetics, electrodynamics, magnetostatics, magnetodynamics, and really full wave problems where your waves can propagate over long distances. This is an electrostatic example produced with a OneLab software at the University of Liège. It shows the potential and the electric field next to a high voltage tower. Another example in my magnetodynamics. This is the study of a coil system, and well, these simulations then allowed, for instance, to compute the ohmic losses in the coils, to also compute the forces on the windings. We moved on to another problem, which is simulation of an electric machine, again with this OneLab open source software. You see that, well, here the finite element mesh and well, different parts of the machine, and the plot shows you the calculation of the characteristic of this machine, the torque as a function of slip. Another example, this one coming from the COMSOL commercial software. It's a study of the antenna crosstalk on an airplane. So on the top you have a transmitting antenna. On the bottom you have a receiving antenna. And what is shown here is a result of a set of 3 simulations in which the receiving antenna was placed at 3 different positions under the fuselage. And this is an example of these parameterized problems in which, well, before you start finite element solver, you say, well, please compute the solutions for these 3 positions of my receiving antenna, and you get that in a single simulation. There are very large numbers of applications in microwaves. This is, again, with OneLab simulation of a wave propagating along the waveguide junction. And so a wave is coming in from the diagram on the bottom left, and then is split into components in the branches of the T. So this kind of simulation allows you to compute the equivalent electrical parameters of this junction, for instance. Microwave circuits, this is another example, a very small component, modeled in great detail, and the plots on the bottom show you the equivalent electrical parameters here, which are called the scattering parameters of this hybrid junction. So there are many, many other areas of applications in electronics, modeling of printed circuit boards, electromagnetic compatibility, study of electromagnetic interference, medical applications in electromagnetic shielding, studies of stealth material, search for new microwave absorbing materials, studies of stealth aircraft and camouflage. Of course, these problems often call for other approximate methods because, well, typically the wavelengths are very short and the distance is very large. And all these models have a more and more important role in assisting and guiding the experimental approach and the prototyping. So often now a lot of savings can be done in time and cost by having more detailed electromagnetic simulations, which are then able to guide the designs and to reduce the number of prototypes that would otherwise be required. Just a few other illustrations here, biological applications. This shows the electric field induced on the human body from an overhead power electric line. There are applications in the design and optimization of biomedical devices, implants, pacemakers, to assess the exposure of humans and animals to radio frequency and microwaves, and for which there are regulatory limits in all countries and over Europe, for instance. This can be used to analyze the safety of radio frequency implants, for instance, when a person undergoes magnetic resonance imaging. These programs allow to assess the heating of tissues. They can also be used in the optimization of the magnetic resonance imaging devices themselves, for instance, to design systems of coils which produce the most smooth possible magnetic field and the best possible RF impulsions that will allow to improve the image quality. I quote here a commercial product, Sim4Life, which includes a broad library of tissue models and also sample virtual populations of humans and animals. And this allows for quite a lot of similar studies. And then I will conclude with an example from our research here at Plasma Physics Laboratory at FEM KMS. We study the radio frequency heating of plasmas, which are the ionized gases which are used in fusion research. And so we specialize in the design and modeling of these antenna systems. This is just an example of a simulation of one of the antennas of the jet tokamak. And another example of design study for the antenna which is pictured at the middle here, which was called the jet Etherlink antennas, and for which you can see that the RF solver has allowed us to optimize the shape of the different conductors and strongly reduce the maximum electric field on this antenna. So in conclusion, I would say that since electromagnetics is more than ever ubiquitous in engineering applications, be it in industry, health, defense, everyday life, it's very important to be able to accurately model complex practical simulations. And then the finite element method plays an increasing role in product development and validation. Most of the time, of course, still in conjunction with experimental tests and experimental confirmation. And as I already said, this can often reduce the necessary amount of prototyping. So also a very broad variety of high quality and versatile simulation tools are available, both open source and commercial. You will find a short sample in the references. The finite element method is extremely flexible and is therefore one of the main methods in electromagnetics, and given that it allows to deal with complex geometries, in particular curved boundaries, complex cocktails of materials with inhomogeneous properties. It allows to easily refine meshes, and it also allows to combine problems of different nature, like I mentioned earlier, the electrical and thermal problems. And I hope that this brief guided tour has really conveyed the excitement and enthusiasm at the possibilities which are offered by this technique. Thank you very much. So on this view graph, you will find some references to historical ones about the finite element method, a specialized book on the finite element method in electromagnetics, and then some very interesting presentations by the colleagues at Liège University on their own software and approaches. I will also recommend you to visit the websites which are listed here. On the left column, you find several examples of open source softwares, including the OneLab developed at Liège. And then sample commercial softwares on the right column. For instance, for ANSYS, we have a license here at the school, and we employ it quite a lot with our research activity. And well, I would say that on these sites, you will find scores of additional applications. So that if you're curious about the method, I really recommend you to pay them a visit and have a look around. Finally, just say a big thank you to Professor Christophe Geuzen from the Applied Computational Electromagnetics Lab at the Université de Liège. So again, thank you very much for your attention.